What is the best evidence for the resurrection? And what is the best case against it? We have two scholars with us today who've both written extensively on this. My first guest, Mike Licona, wrote a book called The Resurrection of Jesus, massive book defending the case for the resurrection that I use in my class at Biola University. We also have this New Testament scholar, Dale Allison, who's written a book also called The Resurrection of Jesus that I would consider one of the best supports and at times criticisms of the historical case for the resurrection. You guys know each other, you're friends, you've interacted before. Thanks for coming on to unpack this with me.
Happy to be here today.
Indeed.
Well, we're going to get to plenty of areas of disagreement, but I think it's going to be really interesting for our viewers to see some areas of common ground. So, for example, Dale, you wrote that Jesus did not exist is well nigh incredible. And Mike, I know you would agree with that. Both of you firmly agree on the crucifixion of Jesus, so his existence, his crucifixion. Then when we get to the burial, we might start to see some slight differences, but let's find out. Dale, here's what you wrote. I'd love you to comment on this and tell us why you hold this view. You said, quote, "I find it likely that a man named Joseph, probably a Sanhedrist, from the obscure Arimathea, sought and obtained permission from the Roman authorities to make arrangements for Jesus' hurried burial." So you have the name, you have his position, you have where he's from, getting permission from the Roman authorities, and you say it's likely or probable. Tell us why you come to that conclusion.
Well, there are several reasons here. First of all, the earliest source we have is Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 in a piece of traditional material where he simply says Jesus is buried. And so you have to pay some attention to that. And that notice is also confirmed by what you have in the narratives in the first four Gospels that we have, the canonical Gospels. Beside that, I don't think it is likely that early Christians would have, given the relationship that they had to the Sanhedrin and the Jewish authorities. I don't think it's likely that they would have invented out of whole cloth the notion that a counselor, presumably a member of the Sanhedrin, would have buried Jesus. And if they had invented that, I think that they would likely have done something with Isaiah 53, which talks about his burial, the servant's burial with the wicked, and that's not what the story of Joseph of Arimathea is about. There are additional considerations. First of all, you need to keep in mind that crucifixions were public events. They were intended to function as deterrents, and that means they were often at crossroads. They were deliberately in public. Jesus was crucified during Passover. There are lots of crowds in Jerusalem at that time and place. Is a really, really tiny place. And I just think these crowds must have known what was going on, and stories and rumors must have been going from the beginning, and people must have known what was happening, and attention and interest wouldn't have dropped just as soon as Jesus breathed his last. That doesn't make sense to me in such a small place with such an interesting and controversial figure. I'd also say that we have evidence from Josephus, a first century historian, who just says straight out that the Jews did bury crucifixion victims. And that's in line with a passage in Deuteronomy, which traditionally we know was read as a reference to crucifixion. So all those things together, I think, make a really good case. And I would add to that when people try to come up with an alternative scenario, when they try to explain the narrative in terms of some traditions about Moses, for example, or a passage in Joshua, I simply find them unconvincing. So, I'm an historian. I like to be cautious, so I'm using probable and likely. But I think the case here is very strong, and I think it fits with everything else that we know.
Helpful response. Mike, your thoughts on the burial?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Dale said. I like the fact that he brought up Josephus in his Jewish War, Book 4, Section 317. He talks about an occasion at the outbreak of the Jewish War, when the Idumeans attacked Jerusalem, they killed a bunch of the Jews, the ruling authorities there, and they wouldn't allow them to be buried. And Josephus reports that the Jews in the city were outraged because prior to that time, it was the custom to remove the crucifix and bury them prior to sunset. I think this is a pretty good refutation of the view held by John Dominic Crossan, Bart Ehrman, that say that they were just thrown into a common pit. It would seem that in the time of Jesus, that was not the case. And then, as Dale has mentioned in his book, there was Yehohanan, an ossuary that was discovered in the 1960s of a Jew named Yehohanan who had been crucified. The nail is still embedded in his ankle. So that, and since then, they have found a few other remains of crucified victims, at least one of other in Jerusalem. So we know that they were using nails. And so the burials there, I think what's kind of interesting is, I haven't studied a lot so much in terms of the burial by Joseph, but a lot of the debate too centers around whether it was not only a proper burial, but was it an honorable burial? And scholars disagree on that. But one thing Dale didn't mention, a lot of scholars, Johannine specialists, do think that John's gospel, even though the author may very well have known some of the one or more of the synoptics, he's largely writing independently of them. And if his burial account is independent of the synoptics, then you have multiple independent sources, perhaps.
Well, this is a great collective case. The existence of Jesus, we have his crucifixion, likely burial, a solid case. What about the empty tomb? Dale, here's what you write in your book. You said Jesus was probably laid in a tomb, which some women later found empty. What convinces you, historically speaking, that the tomb was likely empty and some women found it?
Well, there's a whole chapter on that in the book. So, and it's a long chapter. So for me, this is a long and involved question. But I would say at the end of the day, as with Josephus, as with Joseph of Arimathea, I find it unlikely that early Christians would have invented the story that features women. I know that there are responses to that and retorts, and it goes back and forth. But again, at the end of the day, I think if this had been an invention, then Peter would have discovered the empty tomb, or Joseph of Arimathea would have discovered the empty tomb, or somebody else. The women become prominent in Mark and Matthew only at the end of the story. And I think the best explanation for that is that there's historical memory. I also think this fits with, just fits very nicely with the notion that there were followers of Jesus, including women, who witnessed the crucifixion, and that makes perfect sense if you followed him up to Jerusalem. And if there are women among the number there, they're going to watch him be crucified. And I don't understand why, after he dies, they suddenly would lose interest in him or in his body. I actually think if they observed the crucifixion, it's overwhelmingly likely that they followed the body to see where it was buried. And it's overwhelmingly likely, if they saw where he was buried, that they would go back to mourn, because that's what we all do with burial sites, right? And if Jesus was crucified on the Sabbath, or crucified before the Sabbath especially, they'd go back there as soon as they could. So I think it fits. Now, I have another argument that isn't going to fly so well, probably with you two, but it works for me. So if I look at Mark, I think Mark is the earliest, and not only is it the earliest, but it's the least apologetically helpful. That is, if I look at Matthew, he's got a guard at the tomb, and he's also got Jesus somehow rising before the stone is removed. And then if you go to John and to Luke, then you get some men who show up also to confirm what happened to the women. You also have some burial clothes to the side, which is very odd if that's theft. So as I read the Gospels, I look at the story in Mark as the earliest and as the least apologetically helpful. And for me, that's another indication that we have some memory. Christians are looking at it and thinking, oh, we have to say some more things here, because this story, this bare bones story, just by itself, is more ambiguous than we would like it to be. So, uh, that's a third argument that I would bring forward.
Well, your chapter is really helpful. You lay evidence for the empty tomb, you consider arguments against it. So you're convinced the tomb was empty, but maybe in the gospel accounts later, some details are added to it that might not
Uh-huh.
have the same level of
That's
historicity.
right.
Mike, your thoughts on the empty tomb?
Well, in terms of embellishments or apologetic stuff being in Matthew, Luke, and John, I mean, it's possible. It's just Dale has done a lot more work in this area than I have, and historians can only go so far. And when I look at the resurrection of Jesus and study it, I'm only looking at those things. I'm not trying to get down deep into and dig real deep in the dirt to try to sift through a lot of stuff. I'm trying to see what are the bare bone facts that we can look at and that are really strongly supported by the data, and then what's the best explanation for those facts. So I don't rule out what Dale just said. It could have some of that in there, but like Dale said, it really doesn't change anything in terms of an empty tomb. The tomb, if it were empty, you could still have a story that you have details embroidered into it to make it more flowery. I mean, some scholars have said that Jesus did receive a proper burial, and that does seem evident. That's very strongly evidence. But was it an honorable burial? The gospel suggests it was, but we can't prove one way or the other. So that's what I would say.
In terms of the bare bones, we have the existence of Jesus, death of Jesus, likely burial of Jesus, likely empty tomb, even if there's later flowering. One of the things that you say, Dale, as well, last point of agreement, then we'll move on, is you say, although the evidence is woefully inadequate, it nonetheless suffices to establish with a high degree of probability that some of Jesus' followers came to believe in his resurrection quite soon after his death. Why do you believe there was such early belief in the resurrection?
Well, there are two or three reasons here. The first one is that the sources indicate that that was the case. And secondly, I see no reason to disbelieve them at this point. And then thirdly, I think that's the best explanation of this third day tradition, which you find in multiple forms, in different sayings in different places. So I just see no reason to disbelieve what's there in the text, and no good reason uh, to dispute this. Now there are some scholars, David Friedrich Strauss, and I think Bart Ehrman at one point thought that belief in the resurrection required some passing of time and reflection, maybe meditation on the scriptures. So maybe it took a few months or 6 months or something like that. I just don't see um, any reason at all to postulate that, and my own reconstruction uh, disallows it. Look, if you have people who have discovered an empty tomb, and if you have the category of resurrection at hand, which I think was at hand for the disciples, and if you have some people believing that they had encountered or seen Jesus, then all the ingredients are there right away for this. So no reason to think otherwise.
Okay, that's great, Mike. Now I know you agree with this. You spent a lot of time in your book on 1 Corinthians 15, the Creed, uh, verses really 3 through 7. And so you would agree with Allison on this. Maybe let's move to a little bit of areas where we might start to disagree. Now, Dale, maybe it'd be helpful if you could explain to us. You have a line in your book where you said, I believe that the disciples saw Jesus and that he saw them. Could you clarify for us what you mean by that and why?
Okay, so the reason I'm saying that is that in the book I have two chapters on visions. And I'm not trying to be reductionistic there, but I end up saying that maybe these accounts were visionary, or when I'm hedging my bets, I'll say something like vision like. Okay. And when you use the word vision or vision like, given our time and place and culture, people are just going to think hallucination. And that's not what I mean by vision. So I think it's possible, not just with regard to the stories about Jesus, but I think it's possible in general for there to be veridical elements communicated in what we call visions. So I don't think all visions are hallucinations. And by the way, I don't think Christians can think that,
Mm,
because there are lots of visions in the Bible in which people think God has communicated to them, right? So that that line is, first of all, an attempt to say, even though I'm going to be using at points the language of vision or comparing things in the Gospels with visions, that doesn't mean I'm on the side of the people who want to dismiss them all as hallucination. And I thought the easiest way to do that would just be to say the disciples didn't just see Jesus, but he saw them. So it's somehow a two-way encounter.
Now, just for clarification before I come back to Mike, when you talk about vision, you made a reference that there's visions in the New Testament that clearly within the text of the New Testament, Paul would think are a kind of supernatural experience. When you say
Mhm.
visions, do you mean a supernatural kind of experience or not necessarily even in that sense?
So Ha, So that's a great question. Um, what I'm intending in what I just said was to indicate that some visions, in my judgment, are veridical. Now, then the question becomes, how can visions be veridical? And I think there's more than one answer to that. You can speak of God as the source of some visions, but I think other visions have um, metanormal sources that I don't understand, but they're still not subjective. So I think, for example, just to be personal and candid, I think sometimes when people see the dead, they're not just hallucinating, right? Now, how
Hmm.
you throw God into that, um, I'm not always sure, but I still
Hmm.
think that sometimes people see the dead. So, you know, uh, I, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Okay.
Fair enough. That's great. Mike, maybe clarify for us what you think the disciples saw and why.
Well, okay, so the approach that I take in my big book is, what is it if we're trying to bracket our worldview and just look at the data and the data, and it's not so much. I mean, as a Christian, I'm going to be more inclined to accept as reliable things in the Gospels than a non-Christian would. That's just going to be my proclivity. And so I have to be
Mhm.
careful for that. I recognize that's going to be my proclivity, and that can compromise my investigation as a historian. So I like what Gary Habermas does with minimal facts, or as Paula Fredrickson called it, historical bedrock. You take those facts that are so strongly supported by the data that they have compelled the significant majority, if not nearly a universal consensus of critical scholars, to grant them. And it's not so much I care what scholars think, but if even skeptics are willing, who have a view contrary to my own, are willing to grant it, chances are it's not just my worldview and my proclivities that are leading me in that direction. So it's kind of like a way to manage my biases, my personal
Okay.
biases. So there's a difference between, what I necessarily believe and what I think we can verify with a really good amount of confidence. So I'm not too far away from where Dale is on this. And in fact, in my 2010 book, the big book on the resurrection, here's how I defined resurrection for the resurrection hypothesis. Following a supernatural event of an indeterminate nature and cause, Jesus appeared to a number of people in individual and group settings and to friends and foes in no less than an objective vision and perhaps with an ordinary vision in his bodily raised corpse. So I think that's where I think that the data is strongly points in that direction. And I don't think that's much different than what Dale says. Now, I would distinguish between an objective vision and a subjective vision. A subjective vision would be a hallucination. You experience something within an altered state of consciousness. Okay. An objective vision would be what I think Dale's referring to here. It is, it may or may not be within space-time. Probably an objective vision's more likely to be something outside of space-time. I'm inclined to believe that what they saw was something that they interpreted to be Jesus having been raised bodily, physically from the dead, leaving behind an empty grave, and that the general resurrection had begun. And what leads me to think that is Paul, in his letters, seems to believe in bodily resurrection of Jesus, and that we will be raised in the same way Jesus was raised. He says this several times. And then he goes on to talk about our being bodily raised from the dead, which implies he believed Jesus was raised bodily from the dead. Now, where did he get this opinion? If we take the accounts in Acts seriously of Paul's conversion, it's nothing in there that would seem to suggest that Paul would think Jesus was raised physically bodily. That would be more like an objective vision. So for me, I think the way Paul came to believe Jesus had been raised physically bodily from the dead is he heard this from the Jerusalem apostles, the nature of the appearances, their experiences. And if you add an empty tomb to that, well, bodily physical resurrection makes a whole lot of sense.
That's helpful. Dale, why don't you jump in here? Your thoughts with what Mike shared.
Well, so I would add something that that I think is really important to this. So first of all, if you look at what resurrection generally means, or almost always means in early Judaism, it has to do with bodies and tombs and dust and graves. It's Ezekiel 37 type stuff taken literally. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that, and here I'm going to agree with Mike, but I probably would go a different way. I think there is a foundation for the passion predictions in the life of Jesus. So I think Jesus speaks of resurrection before Pentecost. I think Jesus speaks of resurrection before he's crucified. And I think his disciples pay attention to him. And I don't think they were 100% amnesiacs right after the crucifixion. So I think the category of resurrection is given to them before these events. And so the way I would put it together is I would say you need three things for this early Christian resurrection belief. I think you need this tomb. I think you need encounters, and whether subjective or objective or something else. And then you need the category resurrection, but I think it's already given to them, handed to them by Jesus. Now, I don't know how Mike understands the passion predictions, or what interpretation he offers. I think this has to do with Jewish eschatology ultimately. But my point here is just that if you take the gospel seriously, resurrection is spoken of and it's expected before Jesus dies. And sometimes apologists will use this to say, well, Jesus was, his words were fulfilled, right? This is confirmation that he was speaking the truth. But a skeptic, you could turn this around, obviously, for a skeptic, and a skeptic can say, well, Jesus thought the end was near, so he thought resurrection was near. And so when these events happened, then they put resurrection onto it, or they were trying to find the fulfillment of his words in what happened.
Hmm.
So whichever way you go with this, for me, it's really important that the category is not just thought up by the early Christians out of the blue. It's there before this happens, or before several things happen.
That's helpful to have those three categories that you described in terms of the empty tomb, the visions or appearance encounters, and the passion predictions. What's your thought on the passion predictions, Mike?
Well, I agree with Dale, and I've published on this in the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus, as well as
Hmm.
in my large book. I think the historical evidence points to or strongly suggests that Jesus predicted his death, imminent death, and resurrection. Um, Dale's correct. We explain that in different way. If I remember correctly, and it's been almost 2 years since I read Dale's book. He thinks that Jesus did predict his resurrection, but he was thinking in terms of the general resurrection of everyone occurring at that time. Dale can correct me if I'm wrong on that, because I may be. But the difficulty is, why is it that Jesus would have predicted his death and resurrection, and then after his death, nobody seems to be expecting his resurrection? That's a difficult thing to
Hmm.
explain. I think Dale explains it well there. And in fact, when I read it in his book, it was like, hey, maybe he's right on that. I really got to think about that, but I don't know. I think I just tend more at this point to go in the direction of Jesus did predict his death and resurrection, but the disciples were just knuckleheads, as it's really narrated or illustrated many times throughout the Gospels. They just didn't conceive of a dying and rising Messiah. They were hoping things would be otherwise. And when he was brutally executed, they just weren't expecting his,
Hmm.
his resurrection. And so it came as a surprise to them. But Dale and I explained it a little bit differently, but we both believe that Jesus predicted his resurrection.
But if I could respond to that, I do think earlier, Mike, you said something about the Christians believing that the general resurrection had begun. Don't I remember you saying something about that?
Right. I mean, this would be after Jesus had been raised, though, and they had seen him, right?
Yes, but I don't think myself that for the earliest Christians there's this firm distinction between Jesus's resurrection and then the general resurrection. I think they're all connected. That's why Paul has the first fruits language, and that's part of whatever the origin of it is. This weird story in Matthew 27. Jesus actually isn't the only one to rise from the dead. We have other people. Uh, and I personally think the texts behind that are from Zechariah and Ezekiel, and their resurrection texts in Judaism. So I agree with you on that. Uh, Now, how we understand the genesis of that, I suppose, would take us into the subject of what the historical Jesus was all about, which is not what we're doing here today.
Sure.
We're looking at Jesus after the crucifixion, not before. But I just have to say that for me, you can't just draw this line at the crucifixion and say these things happened and that's why they thought so and so. I think you have to look before the crucifixion and say they're already living within a certain eschatological scenario. They're already expecting resurrection,
Hmm.
and so
But
on.
then you'd still have to explain why they aren't expecting Jesus's resurrection after his death, right? And we just explained that in different terms.
No, 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 because that's not the only thing we have. We also have an empty tomb and we have encounters. So that's got to make them think this thing has begun or started. So it's not as though all you need are pre-Easter expectations and then you can get resurrection belief. Those things by
Oh, I
themselves
agree with
don't
you.
do the trick. They
Sure.
simply supply the category of interpretation for what happens later on. So I think myself, you need all three things. You need all three things
Hmm.
to
Okay.
get this started. But again, I don't need 6 months to do that. I don't need any passing of time at all. Just a few days. which is what the Gospels give you, and which is what the 3-day
Hmm.
language seems to reflect. This happened very, very soon.
Mhm.
Sounds like you're on board with that, generally speaking, Mike. Let's shift to
Yeah.
kind of a particular topic before we get to. You have this idea called rainbow bodies that we're going to get to. Absolutely fascinating, but maybe one or two more thoughts on appearances. What about the 500? What do you make of the 500, Dale? And I'd love to hear in 1 Corinthians 15 the appearance to 500 and your thoughts, Mike.
Okay. Well, are you asking me to start here?
Yeah,
Oh,
please. Sorry if I
okay.
wasn't clear.
So here's an odd situation. I'm a skeptic and not a skeptic when it comes to the appearance to the 500. So what that means is, um, I'm skeptical of the people who just say, this didn't happen or Paul made it
Hmm.
up. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. I think there's an historical event here. The problem is I'm
Hmm.
skeptical of what we can know. I mean, we just have a few Greek words in passing by somebody who wasn't there. And my way of thinking about this is to compare other collective visions. So I know, for example, that thousands of people at Fatima in Portugal a long time ago saw something in the sky, saw something, and it was connected with Mary. So this is a Roman Catholic apparition, the dance of the sun, and so on. But I've actually read lots of the firsthand testimony about this event. And I can't for the life of me figure out what really happened. I have no explanation for it. It's truly weird. I also know that the people who were there and have left testimonies don't agree exactly on what was happening. It's
Hmm.
truly puzzling. I have a chapter in the book on some appearances of Mary in a Coptic church. Uh, in Zaytun, Egypt, in the late 1960s. Now, we actually have um, thousands of people who saw this thing, whatever it was. I've also been fortunate recently. There's a new book. It'll be out in a couple of years. I've been able to read it in manuscript, which collects dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of firsthand testimony from people who were there.
Mm.
And the interesting thing again is there is something there. And I actually think that there's a problem here for the reductionistic materialist. This is a really strange event, and I have no
Hmm.
way to explain it. But again, if you read the accounts, not everybody's seeing the same thing. And some people are seeing something that comes into focus and out of focus. Some people who are there don't see anything. Other people have these descriptions. It's very strange. Okay. So here I have an event. I can't figure it out, even though I actually have the firsthand testimony of tons of people who were there. We even got a few pictures, apparently. I've seen them. Um, or again, there was an appearance of Mary about 30 years ago in Venezuela. And Roman Catholic devotional literature or Mary literature will say Mary appeared to 108 people at one time. But that's not enough to tell me anything. I want the interviews. I've been very frustrated. I've only been able to get
Hmm.
2 or 3 interviews of whatever this was that happened. So the point is, if Roman Catholic literature says, well, thousands or tens of thousands of people saw the sun dance, or uh, Coptic Christian literature says tens of thousands of people saw Mary at St. Mary's in Zaytun in 1968 and 69. Or if Roman Catholic devotional literature says Mary appeared to 108 people at once in this little place, I think it was by a waterfall somewhere in Venezuela. I just say, okay, that's very interesting. I'm not a skeptic by nature. I'm open minded, but I don't have enough
Hmm.
data to do anything with. So with the 500, I don't know who they are. I can't interview them. I don't know whether Jesus was up in the sky. I don't know if he was slightly elevated. I don't know if there's a receiving line. I simply don't know anything about it. So uh, I don't doubt that there was some collective experience. I'm just not sure uh, what it was. And I wish I knew more. So
Mike, okay.
yeah.
So that's super helpful. Mike, going to have you jump in a second. I want to make sure I understand. You accept that there's some type of group experience, that Paul is not likely making this up, and there's actually something objectively there. And you use the term that this kind of pushes back on materialism. So it seems that there's something supernatural to a degree that is
Oh,
there. Is that fair? Or did I
oh,
put words in your mouth?
okay. So no, I think you're reading too much into what I say here. So
Okay.
what I would say is that there are collective, the way I would argue as an historian is there are some collective events for which I have no explanation. The prize example for me is Zaitun. I simply don't have an explanation. That for me should be a caution to the skeptic. That is, I don't think once you know everything, you automatically have your pat answer or your easy way of explaining it away. And the story of the the 500 might be like that. But on the other hand, a skeptic could simply say, we have stories of groups of people seeing things in the sky, and we can be a little skeptical of that. So Constantine's army, by this conquer and so on. We have that story, uh, which most historians, wonder about. So for me, the 500 is just frustrating. It may, I'm not being skeptical. I don't want to be reductionistic about it. I'm simply saying, as an historian, I can't do much with it. Okay.
Okay.
Although I don't doubt that something interesting must have happened. But as a historian, I don't see how I could do more with Paul's words.
Mm, fair enough. Mike, go ahead.
So I agree with Dale there. Okay. And that's why, when I define resurrection as I do in my book, it's a very broad, non-specific kind of definition that could include objective visions as well as bodily resurrection. Okay. But then, what am I inclined to believe then? All right. So there's what I think we can draw a really, really solid conclusion from based on the data, and then what I might be more inclined to believe. And I'm more inclined to believe that the appearance to the more than 500 was more than just some sort of an objective vision. And what leads me to go that way is Paul again. He believes resurrection as a bodily event. He believed Jesus's resurrection was a physical bodily event, which would have left behind an empty grave of some sort. And where's he getting this from? He's probably, I think he's getting it from the disciples and the nature of their appearances. So I'm thinking these earliest Christians believed Jesus had been raised bodily, physically from the dead. And that's one thing on which Bart Ehrman and I agree. They believed that Jesus had been raised bodily, physically from the dead. Now, it seems to me then that since this early oral tradition would have been circulating originally in Jerusalem, probably with apostolic origins, that it would, and I'm a little bit different than Dale here. I tend to regard this list of appearances as something in chronological order, because he says he appeared to Peter, then, last of all. So I see it that way. So the appearance to the more than 500 would have come after the appearance to the 12, but before the appearance to James. And if the book of Acts is correct, well, you got James and the brothers of Jesus who are followers at that point at Pentecost. So in that case, the appearance to more than 500 would have happened before Pentecost. I just see it as something that would probably be whatever the nature of that appearance was, they perceived that Jesus had been raised bodily, physically from the dead. To me, that makes the most sense. And for Paul or the apostles in Jerusalem to include that in the oral tradition, if it was an entirely different character than what the rest had experienced, would seem unlikely to me.
Okay, to push back a little bit, Paul puts his own account at the end of this list. And you said
Fair
earlier
enough.
that you think
Fair enough.
that his experience in Acts looks like a vision. Actually, it calls it a vision, right? At one point,
Yeah.
his heavenly vision. So if Paul can do that, I'm not sure why other people can't do that. And the other thing is that, as I argue in one chapter of the book, I think we should pay some attention to the fact that Christians down through the ages have had visions of Jesus, and it still goes on. And most of those people who have visions of Jesus think that he rose from the dead and think that the tomb was empty and that he rose bodily, but they will still have no trouble saying that Jesus appeared to them, and that for them this is proof that he is still alive. Uh, so I think once you believe in the resurrection, that you can take appearances as confirmation that Jesus still lives and confirmation of your belief in resurrection, but not every appearance has to be physical. So a little pushback there.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Dale. I think that's a fair answer. Good answer.
Do you want to weigh in on kind of the Marian apparitions and the thoughts on that Dale brought up? Do you see that a little differently,
Yes.
or move
Yeah,
on?
sure. So I'm not Catholic. So it's not really within my theology that Mary would appear, and I don't really see any reason for her to, but I can't rule it out. I do think I agree with Dale here that it is supernatural or spiritual, probably in nature. My friend Ken Samples has written on this, and he and I both spoke at a conference in Alabama a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago. And he has actually gone over to Medjugorje, Croatia, and interviewed one of the seers for one of these major Marian apparitions that occurred. I think it was 1981. So he met this guy, one of the seers, as an adult now. And he said while he was there, that seer actually experienced another apparition of Mary. And they go into these trances where they see Mary. And when he came out of this trance and said that he had just seen Mary, Ken asked him, he said, "Has she ever spoken to you?" And he said, "Yeah, she did once." He said, "Well, what did she say?" "Well, she recommended that I read a certain book." "Well, what's the title of the book?" So he told him. Ken went back and looked at that title. I looked up that book, and it was actually a book on the occult. So that's kind of interesting. So I'm not going to say that all Marian apparitions are demonic or something like that, but I do think I think that's an interesting observation. So I'm not ruling out Marian apparitions. Is it Mary? I'm not inclined to believe it is, but I don't rule it out. And I think the thing with the one seer from Medjugorje is kind of interesting what he said.
That is interesting. As tempted as I am to explore that further, let me pull us back to one of the biggest evidences that is given for the resurrection is the appearance to Paul. Would you talk about how you see that, Dale? What you think you saw, what you think we can know historically?
Well, first of all, I give some reasons in my book for thinking that the stories in Acts probably go back to a story Paul told. There are some scholars who just say this is an Acts and we can't pay any attention to them. I think there are subtle lines of continuity between what you find in Paul and what you find in Acts. So I think the gist of what you have in Acts is probably true. I don't know, again, as an historian, how you can get behind a vision or get into a vision and decide what all the causes are and so on. But again, I would go back to what I said earlier with regard to interpreting the resurrection with the first disciples. The category is already there. The category is already there for Paul. In other words, he has been persecuting Christians. If he's doing that, he has to know what they're saying. He has to know something about their claims. He has to know they're saying Jesus is the Son of God and that he's risen from the dead and so on. So he has this experience. And then I think he's not just interpreting it sort of in and of itself. I think he's he's in effect saying at some level of his psyche, oh gosh, those guys are right. And so this must mean such and such. So again, I think that what's happening here is Paul's not given a bunch of theology out of the blue. He actually knows the theology and rejects it, but he has this experience which makes him think, oh, that theology is the right one, and I've been wrong. Um, Again, as an historian, I don't know how to get into this. Um, Even apart from my Christianity, I don't think all visions are purely subjective. I think we need to be open-minded. Actually, as Mike was trying to be a minute ago with Marian apparitions. So yeah, I think I'll hand that off to Mike at this point, because one of the things I do when I'm looking at Paul's vision is just survey a lot of different explanations and say, well, you know, maybe, but how could you ever prove for it? You can't disprove that Paul had epilepsy, right? But you can't prove he had epilepsy. There's no reason to think that. So it's very hard to get into this. Look, so Peter has a vision in Acts, and he sees a blanket come down from heaven, and he sees some animals in it, right? How would you evaluate that experience as an historian? I just don't know how to get to it. It's an ecstasis. It's some kind of trance. It's a vision. It's some kind of uh, I, I'm not quite sure what it is. Right? Some kind of dream state. Anyway, uh, I have no way as an historian to be able to say, well, God was speaking to Peter, or as an historian to say, well, I know darn well God wasn't speaking to Peter and it was all hallucination. It's very difficult. Um, and frustrating, the limitations of historians. I'm always going back to something Origen said in his commentary on the fourth gospel, which is it's really hard often to show things happened even if they did. Even if they did. History um, history has its limitations, which is why history isn't all there is. It's not the only discipline, right? We need philosophy and theology and everything else. So just speaking as an historian, I don't know how to fix the nature of Paul's visionary experience. Mike may have a different view, but that's my view.
Yeah, I'd say I agree with everything you said there. But what I do, I go a little bit further, and I want to apply arguments of inference to the best explanation. So if I were to just look, if we were just to look and isolate the appearance to Paul, there's not much we could say about it. In fact, we might be inclined at first to say it's a hallucination, and that reports of his experience, conversion experience in Acts, has been embellished to include some traveling companions who took part in elements of that experience. But it's when you consider everything. So if you just look at the appearance to Peter, you say, okay, well, it could have been a grief hallucination. You look at Paul, maybe an epileptic thing or whatever, if you just looked at those things individually and isolated them, yeah, we just can't know much. But it's when what historians do is they look at all the relevant data, and then a hypothesis has to be able to provide an adequate explanation for the collection of those data. And so when you look at, well, it's not just Peter, it's Paul. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. You also have several appearances to groups, which seems to exclude hallucination, or at least make hallucination wildly improbable. Oh, you got an empty tomb too, perhaps? Wow. You start to put all these things together, and as a group, this collection, excuse me, it seems to me that the resurrection hypothesis explains it better than any competing hypothesis.
One of the things that I think is at play here in some of our disagreements is the difference in methodology. I'd love to hear you spell out a little bit of You both have described yourselves as Christians. You're looking at this historically, but seem to differ in terms of how you approach these questions. So why don't we start with Dale? How would you describe your historical approach in looking at questions like the resurrection?
Well, my frivolous answer is that I'm more sympathetic to the atheist. And so I'm always asking, what does somebody who not agree with me think? So so I have a problem here because at the end of the day, I say God raised Jesus from the dead. All right, so I'm in the Christian camp. It's just that I think it's harder to get there with purely historical reasoning. So, for example, I'm not a Mormon. But there are Mormons and there are Mormon apologists, and Mormon apologists will say something, I think, analogous to what Mike just said. So they'll say, you have Joseph Smith, who was an unlearned person, and he couldn't have, produced the Book of Mormon. And then you have these witnesses, actually two groups of witnesses at the beginning of the Book of Mormon. How do you explain that? And then you have the story of the angel Moroni and the story of the glasses and so on. And what the skeptic does, the person who's not a Mormon, uh, says is, well, there's one explanation for this, and there's one explanation for that, and there's another explanation for this. So you actually don't offer a unified explanation. You say, well, here's how we explain the witnesses. And then it's something else again to explain the Book of Mormon if it wasn't from the angel Moroni, or it wasn't on the tablets, or it wasn't dug up, and so on. So at the end of the day, I'm in Mike's camp. I just think that it takes more than inference to the best explanation.
Mm,
Um, if you're trying to overthrow a worldview, worldviews are really entrenched things. So if I were a skeptic, and this is what I argued in the book, I said I wouldn't deny that the tomb was empty or that people thought they saw Jesus. What I would say is, well, the tomb was empty, and it was probably because of tomb robbers, and that would explain, why the stone is rolled away and why it happened in the middle of the night, and so on. And you can say, well, that's not probable. But then the retort to that is, well, you Christians are saying some guy rose from the dead. That's not very probable either. So I would just say, well, okay, a tomb robber. And then again, if I'm a skeptic, I'm just going to think that all visions are hallucinations. And I know about some collective visions, or lots of people have seen Mary. So I'm just going to say the same sort of thing. I'm not in that camp, but I understand the camp. I understand people who look at this and just say, no, it can't be. That's where they start. They don't have my worldview. And um, it's not that I'm averse to arguing about worldviews, or that I don't think some arguments about God aren't better than others. It's just that at this point, this particular point, even though this is the center of Christian theology, that doesn't, for me, mean that you can establish it historically. So that's where
mm,
we are different. I'm more sympathetic, I think,
mm.
uh, to to uh, to to the view of the skeptic.
Mike?
Well, yeah, I think he's probably right there. Now, I've struggled and tried to think as the skeptic when I was doing my heavy research on this. My doctoral supervisor, Jan van der Vaart, whom Dale knows, he and Gary Habermas and William Lane Craig and my wife could all tell how viciously I wrestled with this stuff,
Mm,
and bracketing my worldview and trying to be as objective with this as possible. I still do that. I mean, today I'd say sometimes people say, well, what do you think is the toughest objection to the resurrection? I don't think most of what's offered out there is that tough. But if when I look at it, I think, well, if I were a Muslim, and let's just say that the evidence we
mm,
had for Islam being correct was on par for what we have for the resurrection, and that we did not have that evidence for the resurrection. So if you just kind of flip-flopped, and they had the evidence for the truth of Islam that we have for Christianity, but we didn't have what we have, would that be enough to persuade me as a Christian to become a Muslim? And I honestly don't know that that's the case, because I don't like Islam. It's not attractive in the least to me. So would that the amount of evidence be enough to pull me over? I don't know that it would be. So but that's a little bit different than the question about did Jesus rise? Because as historians, you know, I can look at this, and Dale says, well, arguments of inference to the best explanation are inadequate to overthrow a worldview. Correct. I agree with that. However, I'm not responsible as a historian to convince others. If they are handicapped by the worldview, if I have done my best and have, you know, done what I think is a decent job of bracketing my worldview while my investigation proceeds. And I think Dale works hard at this himself. I think he's one of the most honest historians of Jesus that I've ever met. I mean, he was very inspirational to me when I was doing my doctoral research. So I think he's a fantastic model of a historian. But I think the inability to convince someone with a worldview that, like, if you're an atheist or if you're a Muslim and you're not convinced, it's not my responsibility to convince them. If they are handicapped by their worldview, then that's their problem. It's not mine. If I'm handicapped by my worldview and atheism is true, that's not the atheist problem. That's my problem. And that's why I try my best to bracket my worldview while my investigation proceeds, because the thing that keeps me up at night is a line that came from the movie Risen, and it's which I love that movie, and it's after the resurrection of Jesus and right before the ascension, and this Roman tribune is talking to Jesus late at night, and Jesus says, "What troubles you? What do you fear?" And he said, "You know, being wrong, and it cost me eternity." And so that haunts me sometimes, and it's like, well, you know, I better do my best. I mean, maybe God will overlook if I get it wrong, but I want to do my best, my very best, to be as objective as possible, because I don't have to fear truth. And if I've got it wrong, I want to know that I'm wrong. But I do think arguments of inference to the best explanation are a really good way to weigh hypotheses to see which one best explains the data. And the one that best explains it, I think, is probably true.
Dale, please.
Just to add something, I actually think that Mike's book is really good at dismantling the standard skeptical hypotheses. That is, if you look at the views that he's attacking, if you look at Gerhard Ludemann and other theories of how the resurrection got started, they are pretty weak, right? That's why I decided, trying to be honest with the data in my book on the resurrection, to try to come up with a better skeptical scenario. So I'm playing devil's advocate. I'm trying to figure things out. And at some point, maybe Mike will write an article explaining why my best skeptical scenario is also not worth taking seriously. But at this point in time, I think the thing I can come up with should give some refuge to a skeptic, and they should be able to say, okay, you know, Allison says this is possible. Okay, the resurrection's unlikely. I don't like the resurrection, so I'm going to live in this camp. So, you know, I did my best to come up with an alternative scenario, even though I don't live in that world, and I thought that was the honest thing to do.
Well, your book definitely, you ask tough questions and critique both sides, I think. So let me ask you this. This wasn't planned, but I'd be curious how both of you would answer this. Is, Mike, if somebody asked you, why are you a Christian? Presumably you would point towards the resurrection as at least a piece of that, historically speaking. Where does that rank in your answer as you would speak to someone said who's a skeptic? Hey, why should I consider becoming a Christian? Would you lay out the evidence thinking there's some merit to it, whether or not the person ends up believing? Is that the route you would go?
Well, if you're asking why I'm a Christian, maybe it'd be why am I still a Christian? I mean, I didn't become a Christian because of the evidence for the resurrection. I became a Christian at age 10,
Mm.
and certainly my epistemological processes weren't really developed at that point. I was looking for an answer for several years, and a Christian magician came in to our Sunday school class at church, and he did magic tricks or illusions, whatever you want to call them. He related the gospel to them. And it's like, wow, this made sense. And for the first time, it was like, yeah, it's not what I do; it's what Christ did for me. And it was a Presbyterian church, United Presbyterian Church, a denomination back then. And he gave an invitation, and three of us went forward because I thought this is what I've been looking for, you know. So that's how I became a Christian. But I don't think my faith would have survived without evidence to suggest that Jesus rose from the dead. That's what Gary Habermas pointed out to me at one point. And it's like, wow, you know, you look at it and it's like, well, that's pretty cool stuff. But I don't know that even that would be enough. I mean, I have, just like Dale talks about in his book, Encountering Mystery, I've had several, call them spiritual or paranormal. I would refer to them as demonic, some of the experiences that I've had in my life. There's, of course, answered prayer. And I'm not talking about just regular answered prayer, maybe a handful of radically answered prayer that seems to go beyond coincidence. And some things like that convinces me. And then there are some logical arguments for God's existence. I like the Kalam cosmological argument. The moral argument, I don't think is the strongest, but I think it's quite persuasive. So I look at some arguments for God's existence. I look things like well-evidenced near-death experiences, veridical apparitions, extreme answered prayer, paranormal phenomena that I think so strongly point to a spiritual or supernatural dimension of reality that one can hardly do an objective look at the data, deny it, and still call themselves as a realist. So I think the background there suggests that a supreme intelligent being who's responsible for the creation of the universe exists, that a spiritual realm exists, that when you look at historical Jesus research, to see that he made claims to being divine in some sense, that he performed deeds that astonished crowds, that he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms, that the evidence strongly points or suggests that he actually rose from the dead. It seems to me that the Christian view provides the most unified theory of reality. So that's why I'm a Christian today.
That's super helpful. Dale, would you be okay answering that question for you?
Well, I don't have anything as eloquent as Mike just gave you. I was born into a Presbyterian church,
Mm.
and I guess I would say that I grew up as a Christian, and then I've had experiences that seem to reinforce that.
Mm.
And my experience has been more, I haven't had reasons to throw away what I had been given,
Mm.
but I have spent a life sort of revising and modifying and interpreting and trying to figure out what to hold and what to rethink and what to revise and what to regard as just something I don't want to keep. But the
Mm.
other thing, and this is not Mike at all, is that when it comes to this, I'm a bit of a pragmatist. That is, it just makes sense of my life. It makes sense of my life as I live
Mm.
it. It sort of works, right? And that's nothing
Mm.
I can generalize. It's nothing I can
Mm.
turn into apologetics. But again, I don't see a reason to throw away what I was given, although I have reasons to, rethink things all the time. But the basic foundational faith that I was handed, I've just kept. Now, by the way, I should say that also scares me, right? That
Mm.
scares me because, I am what my parents were. That's not a good reason for anything. Um,
Mm.
if the truth is, most Muslims are Muslims because their parents were. I mean, if you look at the chief contributing factor to religious belief, it's parental affiliation, right? So that should bother me. But if I'm honest with myself, I'm going to give the answer I just gave.
I really appreciate both of you being honest and weighing in here. One last question for you. We probably won't have as much time as I would have liked, but you have just this fascinating idea in your book called rainbow bodies.
Mm.
Give us kind of the quick sense of what this is, why it gives you pause. Then I just love your thoughts about that, Mike.
Well, this is something I knew next to nothing about when I wrote the first long essay on resurrection in 2005. And since then, I had learned that this thing called rainbow body has a long history in Tibet and it's ongoing. So, this is the notion that certain sages or saintly people upon death very shortly they shrink, and within a few days their bodies are gone, although some corpses
Mm,
sort of stop halfway. And as I say in the book, there are some pictures of these. It's a truly weird phenomenon. Anyway, and then the idea, why it's called rainbow body, is rainbows supposedly appear near the deaths of these people, and then sometimes people encounter them after their death, or they give instruction, and so on. Now, I say in the book very, 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 very clearly, I don't know what this is, and I don't know what
okay.
to make of it. But I've been misrepresented on that. I honestly don't know what to make. But I thought,
Mm,
okay, here we have a religious tradition in which bodies disappear, and they are bodies of holy people, and it's an ongoing tradition. Two of these supposedly happened within the last 25 years, right? And one of them we know was written up within 2 years after it happened. Another one, we know that the Dalai Lama has said, yeah, I talked to people involved, I really think it happened. So my point here is to be hypothetical and to say, okay, if this is really happening, wouldn't that be fascinating? And what the heck would you make of it? On
mm,
the other hand, if it's not happening, wouldn't it be important as historians of early Christianity to figure out how people make up stories about missing bodies and believe them? So I just thought either way, this should be explored. And the chapter is really a
mm,
plea for people in a position, which I'm not, to look into this, people who know Tibetan languages, and so on. But I do have enough connection to Buddhists to know that for Tibetans, this isn't sort of fable land. This isn't mythological. They actually think it happens to people
mm,
once in a while. So, I know you can't dismiss it as the land of legend, because the people themselves don't think of it that way. So the question is, where do these ideas come from? And from my point of view, it's a completely open question. Christians, we're always saying to atheists, you need to think about the evidence. You need to be honest. You need to face the facts. Have an open mind. Don't be a closed-minded person. Okay, so all right, let's do that. Here we go. Let's turn it around on ourselves and say, let's be fair minded with the data. What the heck does it say? My conclusion is, I have no idea what the heck it says. No idea at all. Just that it sure looks interesting to me, and somebody should teach us about this. So it's just a plea
Mm.
for education in this matter that doesn't show up in books on the resurrection. And
Mm.
I spent enough time discovering, it's not just this isolated report. It's actually this fascinating tradition that's gone on
yeah.
for a long time.
Well, I never read it in all my studies of the resurrection, and we're bumping up across needing to wrap up here. But Mike, your thoughts on rainbow bodies in your case for the resurrection?
I think it's really interesting. I had not heard of them or read of them until
Mm,
I read about them in Dale's book, his 2021 book. So it was new to me, and I think it is something that needs to be looked into further. There's not a whole lot on them, so yeah, I think it's really interesting. If it were made up, and I think if I read or recall Dale's book correctly, and I may not be, the major researcher on this, who is a Catholic scholar, said he didn't know what to make of it, that maybe something real happened here, He didn't rule out hagiography. But Dale's right though. If it is hagiography and you've got these reports coming really, really early, then you got to ask, well, what about the really, really early reports about Jesus' resurrection? My response to that would be, well, what you don't have in the reports about the rainbow bodies that you do it with the resurrection is appearances to skeptics like Paul, like James. And like I said, you got to look at explanatory scope. What best explains all of the facts? So I don't think it would be a good parallel to, or analogy or illustration or cast out on the resurrection. But I do think it's a phenomenon that I don't really have an answer for it, to be honest with you. Now, honestly, I haven't given it a whole lot of thought, but I do think that it should get more thought and the implications of it. So that's just my raw thinking of it.
Well, we need to have some more research done and some doctoral theses, and then we can really analyze it and go in a little bit more depth. Want to respect both of your time, but again, Mike Licona, his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, is the top book that I recommend making a case for the resurrection. And Mike, you know this, you stream every year. We go through your book carefully in the class I teach on the resurrection at Biola. Dale Allison, other guest, his book, also called The Resurrection of Jesus, lays out a lot of the points he made today, but even in a lot more depth. What I think is fascinating amidst the differences is there's agreement Jesus lived, that he was crucified, that he was likely buried, that the tomb was found empty, and that there are early accounts of individual and groups claiming to have seen the risen Jesus. And you both agreed that there was some kind of vision that took place, at least historically speaking. Amidst the differences, and I think the really good pushback that you raised, Dale, I don't want to lose some of those significant points that are there. By the way, those of you watching, I would love to have you join us at Biola. We've got the top-rated distance apologetics program. Think about joining us. Oh, man. You go to bestschools.org. That's all I'm saying, Mike. But, I open another can of worms here. There you go. Lost my train of thought. Make sure you hit subscribe. Have other conversations coming on. But Dale and Mike, so appreciate your thoughtfulness and your willingness to come on and have this conversation.
My pleasure, Sean. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.